Good
morning. Welcome to House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It's Wednesday, January 25th, and we're here this morning getting started with Tucker Anderson of the Legislative Council, and we're going to be discussing the Sports Betting Study Committee report and focus on that and introducing the committee to this topic. So Tucker, thanks for being with us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Tucker Anderson, Office of Legislative Counsel. Wonderful to be with you all again. The last time we met, which was just last week, you all asked me for an overview of alcoholic beverages law. There's going to actually be a surprising amount of overlap thematically with how I introduce those two subjects. Last week, I discussed how alcoholic beverages were pushed to the states for regulatory authority by the 21st Amendment to the United States Constitution. There was no U.S. Constitution amendment that drove sports betting to the states, but there was a similar abdication of federal preemption by the U.S. government around 2018, which has given the states authority to address sports wagering on a state-by-state basis. The backdrop of how this came to be was the 1970s through 2018. A law called the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act was in place, which prohibited sports betting on a nationwide basis. We were in a prohibition era for 40 years. There were 4 states that had limited exemptions under that particular federal act to continue previously existing sports betting operations. The 2 big ones that come up over and over again because they essentially ran statewide and less limited forms of sports betting, Nevada and Delaware. In 2018, PASPA was challenged and eventually overturned by the United States Supreme Court. And the federal government backed away from further attempting to regulate sports betting, which means that there are 2 remaining federal laws that come into play, and that would be the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which governs how the states and various tribes under the Bureau of Indian Affairs regulate casino gaming. And specifically for sports wagering, that would be Class 3 casino gaming. And then there is the Wire Act, which will regulate interstate transmission of data for wagering purposes. But otherwise, this is a state-by-state issue. And in just the last 4 or 5 years, you have seen a proliferation of legalized sports betting in over, at this point, 36 states. Not all of those states are statewide sports betting states. Some are single city sports betting states. Some are exclusive territory sports betting states. And that would, of course, be under the IGRA, which we just briefly touched on. So to introduce the concept of what sports betting is and what the Sports Betting Study Committee was dealing with contextually, all of the sports wagering, sports betting, legalized markets are what's known as ring-fenced states, right? They are all self-contained systems. None of these states are working with each other. And the entities that are offering sports wagering in these states have to deal with a patchwork of regulatory systems when they are interacting with individual bettors in those states. Vermont and its ring fence is currently a prohibitionist state. Wagering is a criminal activity in Vermont. All of Vermont's neighbors, including Quebec, will allow sports wagering in some form. So that's the context. last year, looking at this context and hearing some testimony about sports betting and considering some proposals for initiating legal sports betting in Vermont, the Senate passed along a proposal that the General Assembly eventually enacted in Act 183, Section 55, to create the Sports Betting Study Committee in 2022. It was set up to meet in the fall, which it did successfully every Tuesday, much to my chagrin. And it focused on a series of questions around how Vermont could, and in the view of the committee, should legalize sports wagering, and what the best system in the committee's view would be for that legalization. The committee was designed to have members from various administrative agencies in the state, including the Department of Liquor and Lottery, the Attorney General, the Department of Taxes, the Secretary of State, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and of course, 2 members from the Senate and 2 members from the House. The questions that committee focused on after hearing some early testimony were: should Vermont legalize sports wagering? Should Vermont establish state control or a licensure model for the regulation of sports wagering? Which state administrative agency should oversee the sports wagering market in Vermont? And what regulatory tools will that agency need? Should Vermont legalize mobile sports wagering or retail sports wagering, or both? How should Vermont structure a tax on sports wagering revenue? And how should Vermont structure its responsible gaming resources and problem gambling programs? And all of these are highlighted in the first few pages of the report, if you have it. In general, those questions stemmed from 5 major categories of, let's say, themes from the states that came before Vermont in legalizing sports wagering. The first was, if you are going to legalize and regulate, who is going to bear primary responsibility in that system for offering the sports book to the public? And there's a division in the states between state control and licensing. So that was the first question that kind of came up. Should Vermont be a control state or a licensed state? The second big theme is retail wagering or mobile wagering, or both. To give you some context and background for the testimony that you'll hear later, retail wagering is in person, going to a book location. You might think of this like off-track betting locations or a casino, or going to a kiosk where they have terminals set up at lottery locations and placing a wager in person. Mobile sports wagering on your phone or your computer. That's the easiest way to explain how that plays out. The third major theme is regulatory structures and authority. The Nevada model is kind of the most popular model for regulatory structures. And it's really, what levers are you giving the regulatory agency to respond to what is essentially a rapidly growing market around this product? And are you going to give them tools to act quickly? What's the flexibility that the agency has to work with the operators? The fourth major theme was revenue. How do you get revenue from this? And how much was another question that has come up in all of the states. And this is usually where a lot of the tension starts to rise. The final category is consumer protection. And within that, responsible gaming and problem gambling response. And I saved consumer protection for last because it's going to dovetail into the last thing that I really want to drive home about some of the difficult and complex discussions that come up around sports wagering. Consumer protection in this area faces some challenges because of what the product is. So if I were to ask any one of you, what is the product that we're dealing with in the marketplace with sports wagering, what would you say?
Wow. I'm not used to the folks. So I'm going to let Representative Matt Byron, who has studied on this because he was a member of the committee.
So he's got some ideas.
Answer the question.
Yeah.
So, thank you. So one of my comments when that question is posed, especially to the industry stakeholders, is you're providing an enhanced experience.
That is right. The product really is a contract, right? That's what is being sold to the person. The contract. You're selling an agreement that if a contingency happens, you win or you lose, right? Based on that contingency. You're selling an opportunity, but it doesn't work in a vacuum. This is a contingency based on some other thing. In this case, that other thing is a sporting event, right? So you can't have this contract operate in a vacuum. You have some other product that is part of what is being sold to the consumer. So consumer protection in this space has to operate in two different areas. Has to operate in the contract space. How are we regulating and looking at the contract between the bettor and the company offering the bet, but also how is that entire transaction relating to this sporting event? And how are we dealing with that? So terms that you will hear, and there is a ton of jargon in this space, but you will hear about integrity. That's integrity for the sporting event. And there's of course, 100-year at least complex history of criminal activity related to sporting events and wagering. The most famous being the 1919 World Series. And how are we dealing with fairness, potentially, and how the product itself, that contract, is being structured and offered. And you'll hear a term called house rules. And a lot of this area focuses on how do you give notice to the consumer to address what's known in the industry as informational asymmetry. And although there are very savvy, very intelligent bettors in the space, ultimately the research bears out that the companies that are offering the product know a lot more about the context of that bet than the individual bettors. And that leads right into responsible gaming, which is a part of that consumer protection aspect. So that's the context that the Sports Betting Study Committee was dealing with and some of the material that they were addressing. I wanted to make sure to note for you, we're working on a glossary if you are going to be taking a look at sports betting moving forward so that you have something handy that will help you navigate some of these terms. There's a glossary at the front of the Sports Betting Study Committee's report and at the front of the OLC JFO Sports Wagering Study. We're going to give you another one that will hopefully boil these terms down even more. If you want any particular research, you have any questions, please let me know. We're going to prepare a background on some of the federal regulatory structures, even though they have not really come into play that much, and give you an explanation of kind of the legal history of how this all came to be. And if there are any states that you are interested in focusing on, each of the legal states in 2021 and the beginning of 2022 are covered in the study. And I know that we're working now on covering the states that legalized just in the last year. So if you have any special favorite states that you want to take a look at, let us know and we'll make sure to cover them.
Representative Chase.
Just 30,000 foot, the states around us, are they all using similar models or are they each doing their own separate thing?
There's a mixture. The dominant form in New England and Northeast is the control state model. New Hampshire is a control state. New York is a control state as well in how they selected operators. Rhode Island is a control state. Connecticut is a control state, where exclusively the Connecticut Lottery Corporation and the Indian tribes under compact can offer sports wagering. Massachusetts is a licensed state.
And Quebec?
Also operates through a licensure model, and primarily, I think, through maybe even Canby is their dominant operator through retail. So I don't know if they have an exclusive contract, but I can look into that.
Thank you. Representative Morgan. And I also want to say that I want to make sure we're asking kind of clarifying questions, that we're covering things as they come. So if you ask a question that opens up a big, broad policy that we haven't quite got the background yet, I might ask folks to sort of like,
Sure.
Hold that until we get to that.
Maybe this is one of those, but tell me if you think so, is what's the breadth of what we're looking at for sports? Collegiate? Is it pro? Is it everything? The whole arena of sports? Or am I getting way ahead of the mix here? Or have I not read enough and should know more about that?
You're a bit of the horse in front of the cart.
Okay.
But it depends on how it's defined, right? That's the opportunity in front of Vermont right now, is to take a look at that and determine what the categories of sporting events will be. Broadly, most states cover any athletic event involving 2 or more individuals. And they'll also clarify that includes things like Olympic events where it's individuals competing. A majority of states restrict wagering on in-state college athletics, except for participation in college tournaments. Nearly all of the states explicitly prohibit wagering on high school and middle school sporting events. And because many of the states have a history of legalized pari-mutuel horse wagering, typically racing events are already legal and aren't covered by the sports betting statutes.
Gotcha.
But that's something that some states have taken a look at. You'll also note, if you go through and look at the sports that are included in sporting events, that highlight often is not included. And when I was doing the research, didn't necessarily understand why, but it's because there was a limited exemption from the federal prohibition on sports wagering that allowed somehow wagering on highlight to persist. So some states just kind of set that aside and say, we're not even going to deal with highlight.
So that's it. This is something that will be defined as it rolls out.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm sure that you all know that I would not have spent the committee time this morning if it wasn't our intention to look deeper into these issues in the context of a forthcoming legislative proposal. So today, my hope is that Tucker and the department and help from JFO, that we can just start to point ourselves in the direction of what are some of the questions that we might want to ask, what are the key issues that are on the table, and just familiarize ourselves at a very basic level with this entire world of sports betting. So here today for the 101, and we will definitely be having further conversations in the context of specific proposals. But I appreciate Tucker, you kicking this off, and can stick around to help answer questions as they come up. That would be really great. And I understand if you're getting pulled into another committee as well. So I would like to invite the commissioner to come up and speak from the department's perspective and help us tee this up a little further.
Good morning. Again, Representative Chase.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I didn't meet you last week. I'm Wendy Knight. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Liquor and Lottery, and I'm also the Chair of the Sports Betting Study Committee. So what I thought I would do this morning, if the chair would like, is I'm going to review the Sports Betting Study Committee from this perspective of the chair of the committee. And if you have questions of me as the commissioner, I'm happy to answer those too. So, but my overall discussion and walking you through this is the chair of the Sports Betting Study Committee, just because you're being grounded right now and I think that's a good place to start, if that's okay.
That sounds great. Thanks.
So Tucker, as always, does a great overview and historical context. I just want to walk you through sort of the process of the Sports Betting Study Committee and how we arrived at certain decisions. Tucker mentioned that it was, comprised of 9 members. We had executive branch, legislative, secretary of states, attorney general, and there was one other office. That was executive branch. I think I covered it. Well, anyway, it's in here. We basically, from the very first meeting, we decided that it was not a question of if we were going to recommend legalized sports betting, but how. And that drove the discussion and the meetings that we had. And so when we invited our guest speakers in, we asked them to help us understand the how. It was consensus decision-making, and so there were no dissents. We all sort of agreed. Sometimes the Secretary of State's office would not necessarily vote, but then the report was passed unanimously. So it was a really good process. I will say that we focused considerably on problem gambling and consumer protections. We started off in the very first conversation, having a lot of those conversations. And then what we did is we put off that substantive conversation to the decision point about problem gambling. But it really was a conversation throughout our discussions. So Tucker outlined kind of the key points, the decision points we needed to make. There were some things, and I'll talk about it at the end, some things that we didn't make a specific recommendation on, like minimum age. We had significant conversation about it, but we thought that that was best left to the General Assembly. So I can discuss those in terms of what we felt the General Assembly should pick up. So essentially, the first thing was, should we establish a state control model or a license model? We decided that we wanted to recommend a state control model. A license model is something like New Jersey, where it's set up much like fantasy sports are here in Vermont. So if the appointing whatever the regulatory agency is that would license operators, they set up criteria, and as long as you meet that criteria, then you get a license. It's a little less controlled than what we wanted to have here in Vermont. Vermont has a history of, we're a control state for liquor. We felt that we were better served in terms of creating that better consumer experience, the player experience, as well as those consumer protections by being a control model, as well as deriving the revenues that we're hoping to achieve with the sports betting through a revenue share. So that was the first decision, that we would have a state control model, and that it would be done through authorizing the Department of Liquor and Lottery to be that regulatory body. Right now, the Department of Liquor and Lottery, as you know, is the regulatory body for liquor. We are also the regulatory body for Vermont Lottery. So the only legalized gambling that's allowed is through Title 31, which authorizes the Vermont Lottery, which operates within the Department of Liquor and Lottery, to permit lottery gaming. And there were a couple of state interests that the committee decided were a priority for looking at our as a lens to look at those key decisions. So we wanted to make sure that we're converting the illegal market, which right now we have an illegal market, much like we had an illegal cannabis market, and all of those discussions pertain to how you move from an illicit market to a legal market. So one of the priorities is to really convert that illegal market. The other, of course, is revenue, right? Where sports betting is happening either legally, where Vermonters are going to states bordering us that permit legal sports betting, so they're taking their dollars there, or they're doing it illegally online, which is quite dangerous. So, and it's not, it's not a framework for collecting this revenue. So the other state interest is obviously collecting revenue. Consumer protections, that was an overriding state interest, and then also establishing strong and responsive authority, administrative authority. As Tucker had talked about, this is a really new market, and because of that, the committee felt really strongly in terms of balancing what goes in statute versus what is via rulemaking or procedures on the part of the department, that the recommendation was to really limit the amount of criteria that's in statute and allow the department to regulate this through rulemaking. We'll get into a lot more detail, but that's important because this is such a new evolving market. The second question was the administrative body. So I mentioned that the department obviously has the regulatory authority over liquor and lottery. The one caveat that the committee recommended was that the Department of Mental Health would be the secondary administrative authority for the responsible gaming. So the recommendation is that the Department of Liquor and Lottery be the primary regulatory body, and then responsible gaming would be the Department of Mental Health. The next decision was, were we looking to create a new regulatory body to oversee sports wagering? In some of the other states, you'll learn they have a history of horse racing, they have casinos, and so there's these gaming commissions that is a regulatory body for that. We don't have that history here. What we have is Vermont Lottery, which I think next week celebrates 45 years. So that's the sort of historical structure that we have. And that was I'm losing track of my numbers here, but that's third. I'm looking at, isn't it annoying when you print out a document and there's no page numbers? Could we please print page numbers on the reports? All right, I'm looking at Vermont should legalize mobile and online sports wagering, whatever page that is. It's maybe 8 in. We talked a lot about whether or not to recommend online, retail, or both. And the decision at this point was to recommend solely mobile sports wagering. That's obviously our phones. Some of the other states that have retail, again, have those historic structures of casinos where they have an ability to have a retail outlet. We heard a lot from other states. We heard from Connecticut. We heard from New Hampshire. New Hampshire has 10 times the population of Vermont. They have 3 retail outlets that are very close to the Massachusetts border. And one of the decision-making points we had was population. Does Vermont have the population to be able to support a retail market? We weren't convinced of that. That's something that the committee should look at. The other thing about retail is it's a significant investment. It requires capital investment, particularly for Vermont, because we don't have that casino base. And so we did think it was important to consider at some point. And so the committee had recommended that the department engage in a study to look at the feasibility of that. And one of the thought processes is around to whether to recommend a retail market is not everybody has access to a phone. And so we wanted to make sure that we provided the opportunity for legalized sports betting to those that were looking to do it in a way where they wanted to go into a retail market. So again, get into the weeds there, but we did talk a lot about that, and that was our recommendation to look at that further. The next was the revenue share. Again, a lot of discussion. We heard from a lot of different states, and we heard from the operators, and what the committee recommended was to have the revenue share determined through a competitive bid process. So you'll see as we get through this, there are a couple of different ways to go about the state retaining the revenue for sports betting. One is to have a tax rate, a 7% or 10% in statute that's required, right? And so that was one method that we had heard about. And then the other is to allow through a competitive bid processing that revenue share. And so we had looked a lot at New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, our neighboring states that did that competitive bid process, and they were able to establish a revenue share of 50%. So the committee feeling is, obviously, we want to maximize revenue. And so putting a 7% tax rate in statute didn't make sense to us if we were looking to leverage revenue. And so that's why we had recommended that the revenue share be done through a competitive bid process. We talked a lot about the number of operators, how big of a market Vermont might be, based a lot on the recommendations from JFO. The committee decided that we wanted to have competition, right? So we wanted to not just to have one operator. We wanted to have competition, so we recommended a minimum of 2, but not more than 6. And the feeling from JFO was that was the appropriate range in terms of the number of operators. And you'll hear from JFO and you'll hear more on that, but that's just setting the stage for some of those discussions and why we opted for that. So when you look at that, there's a matrix that JFO put together in terms of what we can expect from revenue, and that's based on few or many operators, high tax rate or a low tax rate. And so we're looking at, few operators, high tax rate. That's the recommendation of the Sports Betting Study Committee. Next, we have responsible gaming and problem gambling measures. I mentioned that we talked a lot about this. When you're looking at responsible gaming and problem gambling, and as you get into it, it would be really helpful to have the Department of Mental Health and some of the advocacy groups that we relied on, the experts, the National Council on Problem Gaming, to talk about the work that they do. And we know a little bit about it because we do this with Vermont Lottery. We have a responsible gaming and a problem gambling component of what we do. It's in our advertising, and we have a relationship for that kind of outreach and services. So you start with responsible gaming. What does that look like? Much like we have, the health department and DLL does sort of consumer awareness, public health PSAs about what is responsible drinking and do you have a problem and how do you detect that? That's the first start of responsible gaming, is to let people know how to identify if you're playing responsibly. And then you move into, that would be the prevention, right? Getting people to understand how they're playing might be irresponsible, and then getting them into the problem gambling. If there's a problem, then there's treatment, there's awareness. And so that's what the recommendation here is, to actually establish a responsible gaming fund. It would be managed by the Department of Mental Health. One of the things that's very important is to have the operators have responsible gaming provisions. And so that's what this outlines as well. There are certain things that you would require the administrative authority to do, right? We would require the administrative authority, Department of Liquor and Lottery, to require that the operators submit a responsible gaming plan, for example. Their operators have various tools that identify when there's erratic behavior. And so we would want to make sure that the operators have those tools, that consumers have access to those. There's self-restriction limitations that the players can avail themselves to. So there's a whole host of problem gambling and responsible gaming tools and techniques that we would recommend having. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds. I just want to kind of outline some of the basics. So I think you're going to have someone from JFO talk, and I don't need to get into that, but.
Yeah, we did that leg of my introduction today. Is
Okay.
JFO here to talk about the
Great.
matrix with some updated numbers.
Okay, great. So I'm going to pause for a second and take my breath and see if you have any questions.
We do have a couple questions, so I'll go to Representative Waters Evans first and.
Hi. I read through all the material, maybe I just missed it, but is there a minimum age for gambling? And is there a way to prevent teenagers?
Yes, so none of this is designed, this is all designed for adults.
Correct.
Just like liquor is and tobacco is and gaming, right?
Yes, but
None of
teenagers love liquor and tobacco.
Correct, but they're not legally able to consume it.
Correct.
So,
In theory, yes. it's
yes,
only for
yes.
adults.
So one of the things we talked about is, should it be a minimum age of 18 or should it be a minimum age of 21? And that we had some robust, conversation around. So we know that if you're 18, you can vote. If you're 18, you can drive. Right, there's all these things, you have privileges when you turn 18. When you're 21, that's when you can legally purchase alcohol. So the committee felt like the General Assembly should discuss that in terms of parity. And we didn't determine whether or not it should be 21 or 18, just that you all sort of discussed that further. There was some thought that there is research out there in terms of developmental compulsive behavior. There's always that young adults, are you capable of making decisions at 19 versus 21? I think that there was some thought that there should be some, discussion about that.
I think if we head down this road, that will be a robust part of our discussion. So I will flag that as a concern and a topic that we will definitely discuss.
It's never intended for someone under 18.
Of course.
Representative Hooker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did I hear you correctly that on the first day of the first meeting of the commission, everybody jumped in the car that said, let's do this, and headed down the road? There was no.
That was the first discussion. The decision was that, yes, it should be a question of how, not if.
Interesting.
For context setting, I think one thing that we might have missed to that point is about the sort of current state of what is happening in Vermont. And I think, Commissioner, you talked about it a little bit, and Tucker mentioned it, but do you have a sense, and I know it's hard to track some of these things, but how many Vermonters are currently engaging in sports betting and just going over the border to place bets or doing it from in-state illegally somehow? Was that part of the
Discussion? Yes, it was. Well, if you talk to Senator Sears, about half his county is going to Albany sports betting. So anecdotally. Yeah, exactly. Anecdotally, we know that people are engaging it. We had this company called GeoComply testify or speak to the committee, and they gave us some data, which is on the Sports Betting Study Committee website, in terms of, for 1 month, I think they gave us a snapshot. It's a heat map, basically, and it showed there were 12,000 in the month of September, 12,000 unique attempts of Vermonters to access legalized sports betting. And they were in New York and in Quebec, Ontario, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. And that represented, I think, maybe 3,000 individual Vermonters. So that was just one month's worth of data that showed that.
So it looks like there are thousands of Vermonters that are currently at least attempting to engage in sports betting or going just over the border to place bets.
I would say that that's a fair statement based on that information we received and what Senator Sears is telling us what's happening in Bennington County.
A follow-up from Representative Hooper, and then we'll go to Representative.
That was actually people crossing the state line, or?
It's all online, so they're not crossing physically the state line, but
Yeah.
it's all done by geofencing. Sorry, I don't have my phone. This is my prop. My phone's there. This is a phone, right? And so the companies have it geofenced. So if you're in Vermont and you sign up with an account, if you travel to Connecticut and you can sign up for one of the operators and you get an account, it's pretty complicated. It's not easy because you have to verify your age and, so anyway, it's not like you're setting up an Amazon account, for example. And then if you come to Vermont and you attempt to access that app and bet, it won't allow you to do that. So that's like, it's digitally crossing state lines to bet.
We don't have any information then on people that actually put their phone in their pocket and go.
Not at the moment. The department doesn't have that, no. That's where anecdotally you hear from folks.
So I'm going to preface the next 3 conversations with just a reminder that we will hear about revenue and numbers from JFO shortly, Senate Representative Byron.
I just wanted to add to that what I think that the heat maps did not capture also was the sort of like nefarious online sites that are
Correct.
from like out of country actors, which are the real danger to consumer protection with bank account thievery, converting your winnings to crypto without telling you, all kinds of really shady activity. So that doesn't even capture all of that that's happening because that's how in-state gaming is actually accessed to these sort of darker entities.
And Boyd.
I just have a clarifying question. So you have to leave the state to create your account, and then you come back in the state, you cannot use the software.
Yeah, you cannot because Vermont,
You can't get an account in the state.
it's not legal in Vermont. So the apps wouldn't, as I understand it, I don't actually have an app on my phone, but that's the way I understand it is you can go to another state that's legalized and download the app and set up an account. It will not work in Vermont.
And am I understanding your point, Representative Byron, which is that there are sophisticated illegal methods by which people can circumvent the geofencing?
Well, yes, because the geofencing is provided by the operators that operate nationally above board. And then you have these other entities that do not play in that same moral space.
Right, so that's a distinction. It's not circumventing the geofencing of the legitimate national operators that are operating legally. There's the whole illegal sports betting, and that's tied to money laundering and organized crime and offshore operators. That's what Representative Byron was talking about is, so there's 2 different things going on. People legally going to New York or New Hampshire or Massachusetts to bet, and then there's betting illegally in that dark underworld.
Representative Chase?
Do we have any data about people using VPNs and so forth to virtually travel to New York and bypass the geofencing?
I don't, but maybe GeoComply does. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to delve into these questions about the technology and what strategies we're currently using and how that'll play in. That's a very, I'm sure that we could go down quite a rabbit hole there, but.
And I think that's
important thing for us to understand.
Yes, one of the overriding, you're raising these questions, which is great because that's one of the overriding reasons for the committee recommending that we legalize sports betting is because there are no consumer protections right now in the illegal market. So there are no protections that guard Vermonters from losing money, et cetera, and all the bad outcomes that can happen when people go into debt.
Representative Nugent.
Just also clear, so if people are using gaming from another state, are you saying they have no protections, whatever that state has in place either? Or are you just talking about
No, if I'm a Vermonter and I travel to Massachusetts and I, download the app, if I'm going to Massachusetts regularly on business and I feel like I want to play there are consumer protections in that state for Vermonters that are betting in legal sports books in other states. We just miss out on that revenue. right? So they're protected in other states, they're not protected here, and we don't get that revenue when it goes to Massachusetts or New York. Massachusetts or New York gets that revenue. And the other thing to remember is, without that revenue, we can't create this legal framework for the responsible gaming and the consumer protections. That's one of the other reasons to create this legal framework, because you're creating that revenue stream for the consumer protections and the responsible gaming.
Any other questions for the chair of the study committee, who happens to be the commissioner of the Department of Liquor and Lottery? I hope you can stick around.
Absolutely.
Hear what our joint fiscal office has to say about numbers. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Patrick. So we are very glad to have you as our third person to talk about the sports betting study committee, and I believe you've got some updated information about some of the assumptions that the study committee made, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so it's my first time in here with you all, so I see a lot of new faces.
Would it be helpful if we did a quick round of introductions? I think we're going to be seeing more of you. It might.
If you're all willing, that'd be great. I guess I'll just start. I'm Patrick Titterton. I'm a fiscal analyst with the Joint Fiscal Office, and I'm sort of taking over the mantle of sports betting from Graham Campbell, who sadly left us. But yeah, it'd be great to meet you all.
Yeah, so that's an important piece of context before we do our introduction. So Graham Campbell had been the legislators on the study committee and has turned over information to you. So you're picking up the baton, but this is fresh work for you.
Yeah.
Representative Matt Arong, Vice Chair, and Representative Addison 3, Representative County.
Representative Lucy Boyden, I represent Lamar 3, which is Cambridge and Waterville.
Representative Lisa Hango, Franklin 5, 4 towns on the northern border.
Michael Morgan, all of Grand Isle County and western corner of Milton. That's my district.
Hooper out of Burlington.
Hi, I'm Mike Berwicki, and I'm from Wyndham County, represent Putney and Dummerston.
Seth Chase, represent Colchester.
Hi, I'm Shay Waters Evans from Charlotte and Heinsberg.
Jay Hooper, Brookfield, Braintree, Randolph, Granville, Roxbury.
Kate Nugent, South Burlington.
Mark Higley, Orleans, Lamoille District, up north.
And I'm Mike McCarthy, the chair, and I represent St. Albans City, at least 2/3 of it. Great. So Patrick, I believe you've got a handout that's also on our committee website for us.
Yeah, so I have some slides. They're available on your website. I know we're kind of doing sort of high level, and we'll get real weedy later on. So at times I might kind of skip over things here and there. But like I said, I sort of inherited this great model that Graham had developed for us, and it's evolving quite a bit as we get more months of data from states that implemented recently, and even new states that have come online since this estimate was recently done. I know Graham testified to the committee just in October. But even since then, with just more months of data, particularly from newer states, you'll see that the numbers have changed a little bit. And also, we're sort of thinking about how we sort of classify state structures a little bit differently. There are some states where, Wendy referenced, many operators, few operators, high, low tax rate. But we've seen some states where they might have few operators, but their system is sort of set up that they're acting more like they have many operators. And we'll get into that a little bit, how we're sort of thinking about that. But if you all have the slides open, I guess just for a quick table setting, there's three sort of terminology that are going to be really important when thinking about how we come to these estimates. The first one is the handle, which is the amount wagered over a given period. So you bet $100, that $100 goes into us calculating what the handle is. It's just the aggregate of all those bets. So, and then the second term is the revenue, which is the amount of money retained by the operator out of the money that was wagered after all the winning bets have been paid out. So is that clear with everyone? And then the third term is this term called the hold, which is the amount of revenue retained by the operator as a share of the handle. You can think about this as the percentage of the handle that's retained by the operator after all the bets are paid out. Another way to sort of think of this is like a vig or a rake, if you're familiar with those terms. Is that clear with everyone?
Yeah, so so I think it might be helpful to really clearly help folks who aren't familiar with the terminology
Sure.
understand the difference between the revenue and the hold. I think that's probably but Representative Morgan.
Well, and to me, I'm reading this and maybe I'm just a moron to betting world, but handle and hold to me sound awful similar the way you've got them there, but maybe I'm missing the boat here.
So
that's what I was going to ask.
So revenue and hold, the definitions seem very similar. I'd say, I think one way to think, I'll use sort of an example to think about what the hold is here. So let's say you have a tennis match. You've got Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, and it's sort of a pick 'em. So each one is equally considered likely to win. In a scenario where the sports books puts that at, you put $100 in, you win, you get $100. 50%, it's evenly split between betting on both sides.
Yeah.
After everything's paid out, the book hasn't made any money on that, right? So what the books will sometimes do is they might set a line where, each competitor is, it's minus 110, meaning that you bet $110, you get 100 out. So your payout is less than double what you're putting in, if that makes sense.
It does. And I'm sorry, I meant revenue and hold sound similar, not handle. It handles the total. I get that. So, but now that clarifies it better. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
So if we're all good there, both Tucker and Wendy sort of alluded to this, but the amount of revenue you can expect really is very dependent on a few key factors. How many operators there are, what the either tax rate or revenue share is set, and what the access is. And another thing we've seen is that, it's really important sort of what the maturity of the market is to determine, what you can expect in revenue. We've seen, from year one to year two, every state per capita handle has increased. And, that even continues for the states that we have data for into year three. So, how much revenue you're receiving really is dictated by the maturity of the market. Like I mentioned, how many operators are allowed in the state, whether they're public or private, whether they're, you can consider them competitive, whether, the access is online or restricted to just like at a casino, for example. And then thirdly, like I said, where you're coming at the for the tax rate. I think Tucker alluded to this earlier, seems that the majority of states, many states have opted for sort of a low tax rate, many operators type of setup. But in the New England area, New Hampshire is a great example of one that has few operators and a high revenue share rate. So, I think just looking at that, just shows that there is some disparity in how states are thinking about it, moving forward with it. And so if you all are following along on the slides, on number 4, we actually can start to look at how that handle, per capita handle, evolves from year to year, how it grows, and how we've sort of lumped certain states into buckets. I think in this first bucket, we've talked about low tax rate. Many operators, we're sort of, I mentioned some states might have few operators, but they're sort of acting when we look at their per capita handle and their hold. like a state with many operators. So we're kind of thinking of that as more of like a competitive market. You know, the lines that they're setting are more competitive, more attractive to bettors. And so it's just a little bit of context for, you know, sort of the difference in labeling, especially for you, Representative Barong. I think you are familiar more with the many operators low tax rate kind of setup, but this is still operating, you know, generally in that same matrix setup. So yeah, I think we've touched on the legal and regulatory structure. One important factor here is, again, access to gambling. You know, we found that in states where, you know, the sports betting is limited to retail locations, so on-site. Particularly, this is more prevalent in states with a casino, you know, history of casino culture, I guess we'll call it. You know, in states like that, you have to actually get in your car, drive somewhere, be in a physical location to do your sports bet wagering. We found that, you know, people in general, on average, are betting less. The per capita handles in those states are less. And sort of something that's also gone along with that is we've actually found that in a lot of those states, the holds are higher, sort of indicating that those sports books are actually retaining and building into their lines a higher amount of money that they're retaining themselves. You know, that's one way that we're thinking of them as being sort of less competitive. So are we good? Everyone good so far? I'm happy to be interrupted at any point if you like.
So am I understanding the data correct? So this is year one and year two. And are those kind of like 2019, 2020 numbers?
Not necessarily, because, you know, in some of them started before then, some of them have started after. We're just talking about the first 12 months that a market's been established. So they're all on different sort of timelines there. But yeah, the measurement here is the first 12 months that a market's, you know, become live in a particular state.
Oh, I see. And you have the date of the date that's next to is when the inception of the market was.
Yep. So I guess just using New Jersey as an example, we'd be looking at June of 2018 to May of 2019, and then June of 2019 to May of 2020. For years 1 and 2.
Any questions about that? Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah. So, you know, if we move down to slide 6, you can see that there is a pretty big range of how states are, you know, structured in taxing sports wagering revenue. You know, most states are applying a tax rate set in statute to revenue, but there are definitions that we don't need to get into right now of how that base may vary in a few states. In states with limited operators, the tax rate is usually what we're referring to as the revenue share, which is that negotiated rate through the bidding process that states are entering into with the operators. And then there's also states that have, you know, government run. So I think, you know, Montana, they'll have like their own app where it's actually a state app, and any proceeds that they earn through that market, that's just all state revenue right there. Rather than having a sort of licensed operator that, you know, pays them taxes to run the market for them. Yeah, and so moving along, we've sort of alluded to this already, but we came up with a sort of matrix, you know, thinking about a competitive, low tax market, which includes states like New Jersey, West Virginia, Iowa, Indiana, and then a competitive high tax rate, which you know, would be Pennsylvania. They're at, I think, 34, 36%. Rhode Island's or New Hampshire's at 50, 51%. And then those uncompetitive or less competitive states that have a low tax rate, At the time, this included Arkansas. They, prior to quite recently, required that you actually go to one of those riverboat casinos to do your sports wagering. It had limited access. We found that for them, and you can look at this on the previous slide, looking at handles in years 1 and 2. They actually have a lower per capita handle because of, either lines are A, less competitive. We also found that their hold is higher. And then B, people actually have to go to the physical location to do it. And then the third, sort of what we're calling less competitive high tax. This would include states like Oregon. I have MO, but it should be MT for Montana and Delaware. Those are, we'll look at and see what we're projecting their revenue to look like, but that's sort of the fourth corner of the matrix. So if we're all good, we can actually look at some numbers now. On slide 8 is where we get into what we're estimating for year 1 estimated revenues. Since the last time some of you have seen these, a couple of these have stayed not really changed, and then one of them has gone up and one of them's gone down. Because we've been able to actually include some of the new states that have come online since this data was last estimated. For the less competitive market with a low tax rate, we actually have South Dakota, and we're actually finding that their per capita handle is like in the $7 to $10 range, which is, some other states are up at around $900 per capita. Just showing, and that's a state where you're restricted to, on-site access.
Patrick, I noticed nowhere yet have you talked about a federal tax. Is there a federal tax, and how is that calculated? Is it calculated separate from other business taxes?
That's a great question. I'm actually not positive how that's treated on the federal level. I would gander that the sportsbook operators are set up as corporations and would be subject to, your typical corporate tax structure. But that's certainly something I can look into.
Yeah, I just was curious as well, if it is a business that also has other endeavors, it must be pretty critical that they keep that portion of it separated out in a specific form to, provide the state as well as maybe the federal government.
Yeah, and so if you just look at a company like DraftKings or BetMGM, they operate in many states that all have different sort of tax structures. So I guess I don't have a great answer at this time of the federal treatment. It's certainly something I can look into. It's possible Tucker may know, but I don't want to put him on the spot.
Representative Hanga.
Thank you. I may have missed this while I was out, and I apologize if I did from someone else's presentation. Is there a definition of competitive and uncompetitive?
It's a little squishy. Previously these were labeled as many operators, low tax rate, few operators, high tax rate, any of those combinations. But what we found is that some of the states, New Hampshire is an example, they have few operators and a high tax rate, but they're sort of acting, and we found that, those states tend to be somewhat less competitive. They have higher holds, meaning that the sports books are actually retaining a higher portion of, of the revenue that's coming in. But a place like New Hampshire, we found that, they're actually setting sort of competitive lines. Their holds are less than some other states. They're sort of not fitting perfectly into that definition. If that answers your question.
Probably that it's very squishy. So no, it doesn't clear anything up for me.
Okay.
I get where you're coming from, that it's not cut and dried.
So it sounds like one of the things that we're going to have to talk about is that the matrix as it's presented here, if I'm understanding it, Patrick, is really focused on how many operators there are, but then there's also the way that the operators, how much of the handle actually gets paid out, and the specific circumstances will have a big impact on the marketplace. That it's not just about the number of operators, which is the kind of core metric in that determination of whether it's competitive or uncompetitive. Am I understanding that?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it, so I guess just if we're looking at the labels of the tables here, previously competitive market would have been labeled as many operators. But, for a state like New Hampshire, they only have the one operator there that they, we see that they're sort of acting more like they're a many operator state. We didn't think it was appropriate when sort of projecting revenues to and lump it in with a state that they weren't actually necessarily acting like.
Go ahead, Representative.
In the business model, is there a fund set aside by the operator in case Rocky gets an extra lucky punch in, or so they don't fold, a reserve fund or something that you're mandated to maintain?
Well, I'm sure,
that we as the state would basically say you're not doing business in our state unless you have sufficient reserves to pay out.
I'm not sure exactly how sports books, budget their finances. Sort of when we're looking at these revenue estimates, what we were really focused on was per capita handle, what the hold percentage is and how we can sort of overlay that onto the Vermont population. I'm not sure about sort of reserving funds. That would probably be a question for one of those operators.
I think that might be a better question for some of the folks who would be thinking, if they're the operator, like the commissioner and her staff, when we have deeper discussions about sort of what would be the requirements for an operator. I think the model that Graham had prepared and that Patrick's picked up on here is really trying to get a sense of, if we make different policy choices, what would the revenue results be? So he's thinking about it more from just the sort of state and the market perspective, whereas the actual operations of the finances of the operator and the state, we probably want to kick those questions over to the folks at Liquor and Lottery and anybody who, understands how the markets work in other states. Patrick, I had a question just about, so it seems like there's a huge difference in the estimate of the amount of money Vermonters would bet in the first year in this marketplace based on the policy choices we might make in setting this up. So am I understanding this correctly, that the sort of two extremes are the low tax rate, uncompetitive market? This model is saying there's a $26.9 million total handle in the first year estimated, all the way up to a $230 million total handle. So it's like almost 10 times the amount if we had a low tax rate in a competitive market. That seems like an awful lot of money for a small state like Vermont, but maybe I'm not understanding the assumptions driving that.
Yeah, so I mean, we're using sort of the experiences from other states. So what we used here, so that total handle is sort of, if we take the average of it's either New England or Northeast states, what their per capita handle is, how do they sort of fit into, how do we then scale that up based on Vermont's population? Who would be legally in this market. So it's looking at states that have this type of structure. If we have that similar type of structure here and we take their, actual experience, and, some of those states are smaller population like Vermont, some of them are much bigger population, but we're sort of we're trying to look at it as sort of per capita. So it's sort of like, even in these big states, what are you expecting one person to be betting? And obviously you're going to have some more intensive users, hopefully responsibly, and less intensive users, people who don't bet at all. But it's sort of just if we're just scaling up, comparing population to population, that's sort of how we come to sort of that difference. So, for example, you said that there's a huge difference between this less competitive market, low tax rate, almost 10x to this competitive market, low tax rate. just in terms of the handle. You know, that less competitive market with the low tax rate, that's what I was talking about before with like a South Dakota, Arkansas. You know, it's more difficult to access because you actually have to get in your car and go physically be on location. Those low tax rate competitive markets, it's more, you know, you can just pull out your phone and go bet on the 76ers or whatever, you know. So part of that has to do with just ability to access. And the other part has to do with the competitiveness or attractiveness of the lines to the bettor. Because if you have a bet that has terrible odds against you, you know, there's no way this is going to happen, and the payouts doesn't really reflect the risk you're putting in, you know, you're going to be less likely to want to make that.
Any other questions about this year one estimated revenue slide? There's a lot here. Representative Nugent.
And this might not be the right time for this question, but were there any estimates done on the cost to the state in terms of like healthcare, dealing with the mental health issues and social issues?
So I think that is something that the committee's report maybe got into a little bit more. What we have information on for the state in terms of costs are what DLL's ongoing costs would be, given what they're recommending for the market structure. And actually, so slide 8 was year 1. You can see how those change in year 2 for the revenue estimates for the state. But if we continue on a little bit further, there's a couple of slides on fees and how other states track fees. And, you know, I guess just for context, typically states, they undertake some kind of program or they're opening a market or what have you, and then they count on the fees to actually fund the administration of that program, and then all the revenue that's coming in is sort of more for general, you know, government operations.
So yeah, so just the operation part of it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And so Wendy actually provided the figure for fees, or not fees, the ongoing expenses for DLL. And in earlier this month, actually, which is $545,000 a year. And that included a director, finance manager, consultant, and then some, you know, IT support and incidentals were included in that. So, you know, at some point you are going to have to think about fees and just how that's structured to make sure that you're ideally covering the cost of operation of this market. But, you know, I know that the study recommended 2 to 6 operators in the state. You know, if you're on the lower end, you could potentially be not hitting your mark. If you're on the higher end, you could be bringing in more fees than you actually need to run those operations. So it'll just be something to think about as you move forward with this.
So on slide 10, that has a quick note on fees. The idea here is that you're setting up a liquor lottery estimate of $545,000, and then you're showing us that states have a variety of fees that many are into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per operator, right? It's the operator paying those fees.
In states where they do have an operator run the market, obviously a place like Montana wouldn't have that because they run their own market.
To that point, the model that we're discussing would drive a fee structure that would sustain the operating costs of the program.
The model that was recommended by the study committee. I want to be really careful about who the "we" is.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah. The study committee.
I'll try not to beat up on you too hard since you're on the study committee.
Juggling hats here.
Any other questions about this, about the fees?
Well, I just have one last slide, and it's just sort of like considerations for you all when thinking about this. You know, Vermont is unlikely to operate a low tax, uncompetitive system like Mississippi or Arkansas, although Arkansas does allow some mobile access now. But, you know, those are states that have a tradition of casinos and, you know, horse racing and things like that. So they have a sort of established infrastructure where they have these retail locations. Vermont does not have that. So it seems, I would guess, unlikely that, you probably go down that particular market structure route. Vermont is a small state, so a structure where you have many, many operators might be difficult for those firms. Might just not be worth it to have many operators in the state. For this reason, if the committee, or if you all established a tax rate or revenue share that was high, we would expect that you wouldn't get a ton of operators wanting to come into that market with, if you had a high revenue share rate like you see in New Hampshire. I think that was part of the thinking that went into the recommendation, somewhere in the range of like 2 to 6. So not a ton, but I know it was important for the study committee to sort of introduce some competition. So more than one, but, like I said, the number of operators isn't necessarily the most important from a revenue perspective. I think we've seen states like New Hampshire where you would see, it's a high tax, just few operators kind of state. We've seen that sort of trends towards a lower per capita handle, but actually in a state like that, we're seeing it's operating at like it's in a very competitive market. So just because you don't have many operators doesn't mean that you can't be, have a competitive market in the state. And then, I think the other thing that's really sort of sensitive here is, I think we've heard that it's been recommended that you have a certain number of operators, and it's been recommended that you negotiate a revenue share with them. But until you actually know what that share is, what that rate is going to be, all of these estimates could be totally off. If the sort of assumed rates that we have in the model don't line up with what's actually negotiated or how many operators you end up having.
One of the things that I'm interested in learning more about is the policy choice around setting specific tax rates versus having the revenue sharing, and how that both influences the operators that might bid in a competitive situation, and then the revenue that comes out of that. It seems like there are multiple policy levers that could be pulled, to borrow an expression that I believe Mr. Anderson has used several times in this context. So we'll have to dig in, I think, but am I understanding you correctly that all of those things play off of each other? So that's the caveat you're making? And
so everything we've talked about so far, that all factors into what the, ultimate revenue estimate would be. It's number of operators, it's how competitive the lines are, it's access, it's what the tax rate's set up to be. So there's a lot of different, factors that, I think on the slides about the revenue estimates, sort of those in the second from the bottom row, we have a sort of hypothetical tax rate. It's sort of an average or what's typical that we've seen for, a state that we classify within that subcategory. Vermont doesn't have to use one of those rates per se. They could be higher, they could be lower. And I think that is an important driver of, what the ultimate expected revenue would be.
Any questions about the assumptions in the model, revenue projections, the recommendations of the study committee from the JFO point of view? I'm sure that we will come up with more questions, Patrick, for you. So I appreciate your time and picking up the model. We'll see you again if and when we pick up a bill on this. So thanks for being here today.
Absolutely.
Committee, I had set aside some constituent service and your chair planning out the rest of this week and some of the things we have before us next week time. So when we break we will be breaking through lunch and coming back here at 1 o'clock sharp. I believe Representative Shy, we're going to have her here for a bill presentation. We're going to be hearing a number of the bills that are on our wall right now over the next few days. And a couple of our folks are members of the appropriations committees and chairs that are coming to do these. So I want to make sure that we're ready to go at 1 o'clock because appropriations time, they're in BAA crunch right now. And I appreciate making sure we use that time wisely. But yeah, so we'll see you all back here at 1 o'clock. I really